to the WEEE regulations. This session is being recorded. We're delighted to have with us two, not one, but two officials from DEFRA, Graeme Vickery, who's been involved in WEEE since 2008, and Matt, who's also been involved in WEEE for nearly half a decade. So thank you very much to Graeme and Matt for joining us. Before we move on to the meat of the session, just to let you know a few housekeeping points. We aim to finish at 12 o'clock, but if there's a lot of questions, then both Matt and Graeme have indicated that they're able to stay with us for a little longer. If you'd like to ask questions, use the chat box to the bottom middle to the left for webinar administration questions. My audio isn't working, or questions like that, and use the Q&A box on the right hand side for questions for Graeme, Matt, or myself. The recording is going to be posted on the Recolight event page, and slides will be sent later on also via MailChimp, so you will have a full record of the webinar available. Before we move on, just a few dates for our diaries. We are delighted as Recolight to be working with the LIA to jointly host a conference on helping lighting manufacturers to move towards net zero, looking at the practical changes they've got to make, we've all got to make in the way we manufacture and distribute products to achieve net zero. That's on the 2nd of May in London, and it's going to be a fantastic event. And also another date for your diaries, on the 9th of October, Circular Lighting Live. The third occasion we've run this amazing conference focusing on all the different good work that is being done on the circular economy in the lighting industry. Tickets will be on sale in March, and there are also some sponsor places available for the exhibition area for those companies who'd like to showcase the great work they are doing in their products and services for the lighting sector. A reminder that we work with Ray Maloney who curates on our behalf Circular Lighting Report, a guide to sustainable lighting. That's available both on the recolight.co.uk website, but also available on LinkedIn, and Ray covers all kinds of developments associated with sustainability and circularity in the lighting sector. So I'm now delighted to be able to kick off the meat of the presentation and to hand over to Graeme and Matt, who are going to talk us through the reform of the WEEE regulation. So Graeme and Matt, if you could switch on, oh yes, you have your videos, and I will hand over to you. Thank you very much.
Okay, Nigel, thanks very much for those words of introduction, and thanks to Recolight for putting on today's webinar. As I'm sure everybody is aware, we published a package of documents between Christmas and New Year, both consultation, a call for evidence, and an accompanying impact assessment. Those of you that are close to the WEEE regulations will be aware that we've trailed for some time now the fact that we were looking at reforming the regulations. The origins of that commitment go way back to 2018 when DEFRA published the Resources and Waste Strategy, and so we're delighted that finally we were able to publish our suite of proposals at the end of the year. What we're actually going to do, we've actually got quite a lot of slides. We're only going to talk for half an hour, so some of the slides we're going to rattle through at some pace, but I know Suzanne is going to share the slides at the end of the session, so you'll have those as a record, and if you do have questions beyond those that we discuss in the session today, we'd of course be delighted to answer those. The way we're going to structure this is I'm going to do some introductory stuff around why we're doing what we're doing. I'm then going to walk you through the proposals in the consultation document. And then I'm going to hand over to Matt, who is going to walk through the proposals that are in our call for evidence. And just to sort of explain a difference, when is a consultation, or when is a call for evidence, a call for evidence? Well, a consultation typically sets out very specific proposals that the government is minded to introduce, and those proposals would be supported by an impact assessment that looks at the costs and benefits of those proposals. So that's what the consultation is. The call for evidence is from a government point of view, it covers areas where our thinking is less well developed and where we're really reaching out to industry and other stakeholders to help us to develop our thinking further and get to a point where we may be then able to consult on proposals. So that, in summary, is the difference between the two things. So why are we doing any of this? Well, the consultation really and the calls for evidence reflects the fact that currently too much WEEE is frankly just sort of thrown in the bin. And that is largely because of the inconvenience and the lack of awareness amongst the public in terms of what they should do with their electrical waste. We've thrown in a figure there. A huge amount is thrown in the bin every year. An even bigger amount is hoarded in people's homes. There's also an issue with some inequalities as we see them between the obligations that are placed on what I'm going to call traditional sellers and those that sell online, and we need to address that. We need to find ways in which the WEEE regulations can better support the circular economy. Traditionally, they're all about just dealing with waste. And the other thing that we're very mindful of is that in broad terms, treatment hasn't really changed significantly since the inception of the regulations. Nigel, do you want to move on to the next slide? So very briefly, we committed to produce our consultation. The most recent commitment was set out in the environmental improvement plan that was published about a year ago, in fact. So Nigel, next slide. So what this slide does is try to on a single page capture what the proposals in the consultation cover. I've got further slides that go into some of this stuff in a bit more depth. We will probably have to rattle through those slides, but let me just spend a couple of minutes on this slide. Fundamentally, what we're seeking to do through the consultation proposals is to drive up levels of collection for reuse and recycling. And in simple terms, there's two ways in which we are proposing to do that. One is to move the point of producer responsibility to the home. So currently, those of you that are close to the regulations will know that effectively the point of producer responsibility kicks in at the point when me as a homeowner takes my electrical waste to the household waste site typically, or at the point where it's been collected by retailers, and retailers are looking to deliver their collected WEEE into the WEEE system. What we want to do is to move the point of producer responsibility to the home. So in other words, requiring producers through the operation of a central function. We're looking for producers to set up and operate a home collection service for both small WEEE and bulky WEEE. Retailers, we're looking for retailers to take on a bigger obligation. Those of you that are close to the regulations will know that they currently have a one-for-one like-for-like take-back arrangement. I buy a light bulb, in theory I can take a light bulb back to the retailer for recycling. We want to, for larger retailers, we want to move to what we're describing as a 0-for-1 take-back. So basically, if you're selling lamps, you provide a drop-off point for people to drop their lamps at. which is very similar to the battery obligations today that rest with retailers. The other thing that we're looking to do with retailers, less interest to this group, but I'll mention it anyway, is to require that where they are delivering large appliances to the home, fridges, washing machines and the like, that they should take away the old appliance free of charge. And in all of that, both on the producer side and on the retail side, we're looking for a sort of parity, if you will, between those that sell online and those that sell through traditional methods, which takes me on to the next bullet, which is around in future obligating online marketplaces effectively to stand in the shoes of their overseas sellers. So if Amazon are selling, one of their overseas sellers is selling lamps, it would be Amazon that takes on the obligation on behalf of that overseas seller to meet the necessary financial obligations in the regulations. We want to create a new category for vapes. You'll have seen yesterday we announced our intention to ban disposable vapes. There will of course still be a significant volume of vapes that come through as waste, and they all need to be recycled, and we want to ensure that vape producers are picking up their fair share of costs. So a little bit of a tweak there. The other thing that we've got, which is I think really important, is we're really interested in people's views about how we measure the success of the regulations in future. The conventional wisdom with producer responsibility is that you look at what's placed on the market, you look at what's collected, and you express that as a percentage, and you would embed that as a target. So in round terms, the EU directive for WEEE has a collection target of 65% of what is placed on the market by weight. We think for various reasons that is, to be frank, a pretty rubbish way of measuring success. So we're looking at other ways in which we could measure success. Other thing just to briefly say is that we are later in the year looking to publish some reforms on batteries, and in many areas we're looking to align the two. Right, Nigel, let's move on. So the call for evidence, that briefly summarises what the call for evidence is looking at. It's looking to sort of define what the right costs are that we should pin on producers, looking at ways in which we can drive the circular economy, looking at the issue around B2B WEEE and how we can improve the regulations to make it easier for business end users to get rid of WEEE that they no longer want. And then the final thing in the call for evidence is looking at treatment standards. In particular, the government is particularly interested in critical minerals and what role the WEEE regulations can play in future in terms of recycling and recovery of critical minerals. Nigel, let's have another one. Right, so let's just quickly look at that in a little bit more depth. Let's go on to the next slide, Nigel. That really just reiterates what I previously described. We're essentially looking for producers to essentially set up and operate a system of collection for small electricals, and also a collection for large electricals. We've split that in two simply because we see the mechanism for collecting small items is likely to look quite different to the circumstance where I've got a lawnmower, I've got a fridge that I've had in my garage for ages and I need to get rid of. But in both instances, would be looking for producers to establish and operate a system. We anticipate through a central function that would look very similar in many ways, I think, to a compliance scheme under today's regulations. Right, let's move on to chapter 2. I don't think that there's, I think the people on the call are mainly importers and manufacturers, so I'm not really going to dwell on this slide other than to just re-emphasize the fact that we're looking to ensure parity between online sellers and retailers, looking for retailers to provide an easier to access drop-off service than they currently do, and a new obligation in terms of taking white goods away when new ones are delivered. Let's go to chapter 3. Right, this might be more interesting, I think, to the group. So as I said, essentially what we're saying is a lot of stuff comes into the UK via online marketplaces from overseas sellers. Very mindful of the fact that many of those overseas sellers are not registered under WEEE. So when the product that those overseas sellers becomes waste, it's effectively the compliant businesses in Recolight and in other producer compliance schemes that, to be honest, are funding the collection and a proper recycling of the waste that those overseas sellers are putting on the UK market. We don't think that's acceptable. And we think the sensible approach is to make the online marketplace stand in the shoes of those overseas sellers. I think that's pretty straightforward. If you want to look at that in more depth, then obviously, you know, you'll see the slide and you'll see the details in the consultation to read at your leisure. Let's move to chapter 4. Let's move to chapter 5. I'm assuming that there's no vape manufacturers on the call. Essentially, we're creating a new category for vapes to ensure that costs are fairly apportioned. This is an interesting one because what we're essentially saying in chapter 5 of the consultation is there's some stuff in there around the need for a central body. I think we're quite clear that we see this central body as being industry-led, and maybe more specifically producer-led, because the main function of this central body would be to discharge the obligation on behalf of producers to operate and manage the home collection obligation. The other part of this chapter looks at performance indicators, and as I said earlier on, you know, we want to move away from these kind of like weight-based targets that traditionally EPR systems are measured against. That's not to say that there isn't a place for them, but we do think that there is a requirement to look more broadly at what measures of success might in future look like. And I think in the consultation we've given 1 or 2 indicators, and would be interested in people's views as to which of those they think are the right ones that we should explore further. And there may be other measures of success that we've not thought of, that or metrics that we should factor in the future. Nigel, I think that takes us to the end. I know that was really, really quick, but I think that takes us to the end of the section on the consultation. I'm going to hand over to Matt, who is going to talk through the call for evidence, probably at a similar pace. So
yeah,
I'm going to put myself on mute.
Thank you very much, Graeme. Yeah, morning, everyone. So I'm Matt, and yeah, just going to talk through the call for evidence. Just to reiterate the point that Graeme made, 2 documents. The consultation is looking at sort of policy proposals, which we have costed, and we have an impact assessment to accompany. What I'm about to talk to you about here in the call for evidence are more ideas which are not fully developed, but on which we want to seek views and evidence. So yes, next slide, please, Nigel. Let's get into it. So yeah, chapter 1, we're going to look at sort of the parameters of the principle of full net cost recovery. So Graeme talked about in the consultation our intention to extend the principle of producer responsibility to the household, whereas at the moment, of course, it sits at the Household Waste and Recycling Centre. But there are other costs with regard to dealing with WEEE, that we're sort of going to seek views on whether or not producers should also be meeting those costs. We know that a lot of WEEE arises in residual waste. We also know that a lot of WEEE large appliances are fly tipped. And there's also some WEEE that is being littered. I mean, that tends to, I mean, in the recent years, due to the issue of disposable vapes, we've now sort of reached a point where we're seeing WEEE being littered. So those are sort of 3 costs which aren't currently being met by producers, but we're going to seek views in this call for evidence on whether or not full net cost recovery should include those costs. We're also going to ask for evidence on what the various costs might be with recovering WEEE that has either been found in residual waste or been littered or has been fly tipped. So that's chapter 1. Move on to the next chapter 2. So we're looking at the existing target setting process. So at the moment, WEEE targets, household collection targets are set on an annual basis per category of equipment. So what we're looking at is potentially replacing this with a sort of a forecast of potential WEEE arisings on a longer term basis. So we would propose a sort of a 3-year basis. And that would be used to sort of set producers' financial obligations. I think the reason for this was to address the issue of short-termism. So some stakeholder feedback suggested that there was a little bit uncertainty in the system, which sort of led to sort of constraints to new investment, etc. So perhaps giving this sort of longer term forecast of potential WEEE arisings might provide a bit more certainty for people in the system. We're also going to look at potentially the pros and cons of a completely different approach, which is known as an allocation system or a matching system, which could actually entirely replace the existing targets-based system, whereby PCSs would be actually allocated a local authority with which to work and to meet their financial obligations and their collection obligations. So that's chapter 2. Move to chapter 3. Yeah, so we're obviously looking to move up the waste hierarchy. WEEE is obviously involved with the management of the material when it becomes waste, but we obviously want to prevent it where possible from becoming waste in the first place. The WEEE regulations could potentially be quite instrumental in this if we can sort of find ways of increasing reuse. So we're going to look at a few measures, get some views on potentially introducing reuse targets. They could be placed on local authorities that collect WEEE. It could also be placed on retailers who also collect WEEE. We're also going to look at modulating reuse evidence. So at the moment, recycling evidence is given to PCSs who deliver WEEE for recycling at an AATF. But if that WEEE is then reused, we could look at potentially modulating that evidence to give it a higher weighting, which sort of incentivizes PCS to try and ensure more material is reused. We could also look at, instead of placing targets on local authorities and retailers, we could just simply ask them to report on the amount of material they're diverting for reuse. That's another potential way, because at the moment, we don't have a lot of data on how much WEEE is actually being reused. And we know there's probably a lot more going on than we have the data to prove. So that would be another thing. Finally, we might look at placing an obligation on PCSs to provide free collection services to reuse charities. So that's another area that we'll look at there. Let's move on to chapter 4, please. Yeah, so in the spirit of the circular economy, carrying on, we're also looking at eco-design. We already have the eco-design regulations, which set minimum product requirements, but this is a way in which the WEEE system could incentivize it further. One approach is called eco-modulation, where you'd essentially modulate a producer's financial obligation or collection obligation according to whether or not they've designed their products to be sustainable. What does sustainable look like? Well, we're going to seek views on this in the call for evidence. It could be products that are more durable, could be products that are easier to repair or have been made with recycled content. And yeah, the more producers have made their products to those standards, they would sort of be rewarded through the WEEE system. We could also apply this principle not just to the design of products, but also to the business models that businesses are using. So if you have companies who are leasing products or providing repair and maintenance support, the logic would suggest that those products are not going to be, they're going to be lasting for longer, not coming off the market. So should those businesses be should have a sort of a lower collection obligation or a lower collection target to reflect that. That's something else we're looking at. And I think this is the last one, chapter 5, please. Okay, no, penultimate chapter. So we also, Graeme mentioned business WEEE. The B2B WEEE system is different to the household collection system. There aren't any targets. It's quite difficult to use. We've had some feedback from stakeholders that it isn't really functioning in a particularly effective way. At the moment, businesses have to try and identify the correct producer compliance scheme to which their product or their waste belongs or was manufactured by. It's a bit cumbersome. So in the same vein that we're looking at improving the household collection system, making it easier for consumers, we'll also look at doing something similar for businesses as well and extending that principle of producer responsibility to the doorstep of the business. So that's that, but there's also another element which is looking at potentially introducing a ban on businesses from sending surplus stock and unsold items to landfill or incineration. There have been a few scandals in recent years of companies who have been doing this on quite a large scale with electrical equipment. So one way is to sort of potentially introduce a ban on that. And I think that's also being considered for other waste streams as well. And finally, we're also looking at treatment standards. Yeah, so as Graeme sort of mentioned at the top of the call, recycling recovery targets. We have recycling recovery targets in the regulations for each category of equipment. They haven't been updated for, well, since the beginning of the regulations. So there's a question there about whether or not they're fit for purpose. WEEE also contains a lot of critical minerals. There's a big drive. We published a critical mineral strategy last year. Big drive to try and sort of retain as much of this stuff as possible. WEEE contains a lot of it. So what can we do in the WEEE system to get more of it and make sure that we're covering more? We could look at providing better information to treatment operators. We could actually potentially in the longer term set specific material or critical mineral recovery targets. That's another potential option. But we also need to look at whether the capacity or the capability is there to actually recover this stuff. So again, this is sort of longer term thinking, but very much welcome your views. I think that is it, Nigel. Yeah, that's it. Thank you very much. And we're open for questions.
Well, thank you very much, Matt, and appreciate both yourself and Graeme's presentation. What I will now go on to do is to pick up and look at some of the key issues that may affect lighting in particular. And for the consultation, which Graeme presented, I'm going to pick up on Chapter 1, the household collections of small WEEE, Chapter 3, obligating online marketplaces, and Chapter 5, the suggestion of having a central body, a WEEE scheme administrator to manage household collections. And then on the call for evidence, I'm going to look at Chapter 1, the full net cost recovery suggestions, Chapters 3 and 4, which encourage circularity and reuse and have some interesting opportunities for helping us as an industry do more to encourage reuse. And also Chapter 5, looking at increasing collections of business WEEE. So the consultations are long. There's a total of over 140 questions. So yes, a snort there from Graeme. Yes, definitely they are. They're quite onerous, quite involved. Some of the questions are really quite technical, and a response can be very detailed. The deadline for submission is the 7th of March. Now, the way we are working to prepare a response is we're working with other sectors. In fact, both the LIA and Recolight are both involved with the joint trade associations. The JTA is a group of nearly a dozen trade associations and compliance schemes that are producer-owned and led like Recolight, who are all involved in the electrical sector. So not just the LIA, but also the Association of Domestic Electrical Appliance Manufacturers, Tech UK, the Power Tools Manufacturers, and others. And the idea is that if we can all work together and reach a consensus view on some of the questions and provide a consistent and coordinated response to DEFRA, it actually makes DEFRA's job a lot easier, because obviously this is producer responsibility legislation, and getting a consistent and unified or relatively unified voice from producers will make their job a lot easier. So by working together, we're hoping to reach a reasonable level of consistency. So within Recolight, we will work with the JTA to come up with a proposal, which we will then adapt for Recolight. We'll get that version agreed, hopefully, by the Recolight board. There are 5 lighting companies on the Recolight board. And once that's agreed, what we will then do is make a version of our response circulated to all our members. But if anybody would like to respond who's not a member of Recolight, we're very happy to send a version to them. And then individual companies can respond either online. There's an online sort of questionnaire system where you have to sort of put in answers to each of the questions, or alternatively, you can just email a document to them, which may be the easier mechanism for lots involved. And I would encourage all to respond, because this is there's some big changes here, and it's important that the voice of producers and the lighting industry is heard loud and clear. Recolight's also working closely with the LIA in helping to formulate their response as well, and pleased to be doing that. So let's look at that first one, the consultation on reforming the producer responsibility system for WEEE. And it's worth just bearing in mind what a producer is, because we use producer in the WEEE regulations, but actually what that means is any organization that manufactures and sells electrical product under their own brand, or resells under their own brand something that is produced by others, or imports into the United Kingdom on a professional basis. So if you fall into any of those three categories, you're classified as a producer for the purposes of the WEEE regulations. So as I mentioned, the first one we'd like to look at is the suggestion for producer-financed household collections of small WEEE. And in fact, I was involved in a day-long meeting of the JTA's working group, working through all those 140 questions. And the question we spent most time on was this one. And we are likely to support the proposal. This 155,000 tonnes of WEEE and residual waste is clearly a huge problem. That is a vast amount of WEEE that is going into the black bins and not being properly treated. And that also brings with it fire hazards associated with lithium batteries. And there's been many reports of bin lorry fires and of fires at waste facilities. That said, there are some significant costs associated with this, so it's likely that our response is going to be caveated, suggesting that we do need to have some fuller scale trials to understand the tonnages that are likely to be brought back using a new household collection system, and what those costs might actually look like. And it certainly would have some cost impacts for domestic luminaire producers. This system obviously only refers to consumer products, not to B2B products. So domestic luminaire producers would see some cost increases as a result of this proposal. There is an important question in there, question 12 and 13, asks if there are any products that should be excluded from household collections due to their properties. And we're going to be saying that lamps should be excluded from the household collection service. And it just makes sense, because most waste lamps at the moment are still gas discharge lamps and some incandescent, which produce health and safety issues associated with the mercury they contain, and they're fragile and easily broken. And even if there are LED lamps in there, actually the evidence tells us that consumers can't reliably distinguish between LED and gas discharge lamps. So moving on to chapter 3, obligating online marketplaces, and this is music to our ears. As an industry, we've been calling on for this for some time, so we'd wholeheartedly recommend supporting the proposal, and we think it would have a material impact on reducing lighting industry costs. And it's very difficult for us to estimate what proportion of the UK's lamps are sold through online marketplaces like Amazon and eBay at the moment, but estimates have been up to 10 to 20%. And if they start taking their share of the costs, then that gives us the opportunity to reduce our costs by the same amount. So once this is implemented, it should be a significant cost-saving opportunity for our industry. There's a couple of question areas that I'd like to draw our attention to, because I think they're quite important, to be fair. And that is questions 57 and 58. And there is a suggestion that the likes of Amazon, eBay should be allowed to use estimated data, the estimates of the weight of product that is placed on the market through their portals. Well, we don't think that's fair. Every producer in the UK is required to report actual weights, and if they're members of Recolight, they put it in through our online black box. And the likes of Amazon and eBay, they do data. That's what they do. And for them to find out or require their sellers to put the weight of product onto their system just seems very straightforward. And to be fair, they've known that this is coming for over half a decade. This was first announced by DEFRA back in 2018. And so we would recommend that we object to their proposal to use estimated data. And we'd also like in questions 61 and 62 to explore if there's any way of making sure that this has an impact on costs for online marketplaces from 2025. Because of the way the WEEE system works, that means that we'd have to be a bit of change the way that data is collected if the legislation is implemented in 2024. But it would seem right that they've avoided their costs for so long that actually we get costs applied to them as quickly as possible. And 2025, please, not 2026. So moving on to chapter 5, this suggestion that there should be a central WEEE scheme administrator to manage and coordinate the collections from households, and we recommend supporting this proposal. It clearly makes sense to have a coordinating body to do this job, and there is a reasonable chance that the operator is to be the Joint Trade Association, the JTA, of which the LIA and Recolight are already involved. And in fact, Mel Duckett from the LIA is on the board of the JTA legal entity. So it would certainly, the proposal would give producers and producer trade associations involvement and the ability to control and influence the costs, and that's really important. As part of the response, though, question 20 asks if there are any safeguards that would be required to allow the WEEE scheme administrator to minimise and control costs. And we think there are a number of safeguards that are really quite important. We've drafted that already, but it would be great for us all to respond in a similar vein, because actually, provided some good safeguards are put in place, it will help us to do the job in a cost-effective manner. There's also a suggestion that the WEEE scheme administrator take on some additional functions that are currently managed by other organisations. And that to us just makes sense as well, that if you've got a coordinating body, it might as well coordinate all the functions rather than having a number of different organisations that for historical reasons have operated different parts of the WEEE system. So that's the key areas, I think, for the lighting industry in the consultation. Now moving on to the call for evidence that Matt described. Just a few areas here. First of all, the suggestions of full net cost recovery, that producers and their schemes should be responsible for the WEEE and residual waste, in fly tipped waste and in littered waste. We recommend objecting to all of those, because actually these are all activities beyond the control of producers. For fly tipping and littering, they're actually offences, and to make us responsible for the consequences of criminal acts would seem inappropriate, and they certainly would be costly as well. In chapters 3 and 4, encouraging reuse and circularity, there's an interesting proposal for which the response is in question 21. And this is something that Matt mentioned, the idea of giving more credit, a greater weight to reuse that is done by a recycling company rather than recycling. And the idea would be that if Recolight on behalf of its members has, for example, a target of 1,000 tonnes of recycling to be undertaken, if we undertook that by using reuse, we perhaps would only need 500 tonnes. So there's a greater value, greater credit for reuse than recycling. We think that's good working for recyclers, but even more important would be if we could extend that same opportunity to producers. And there's some really good work starting to happen in the lighting industry around reuse, where product is going back to lighting producers who are remanufacturing it and then supplying it again. And if we made that reuse of product as though it to be recorded as though it were reuse done by a recycler, that would allow the good reuse being done by producers to be used by Recolight to meet our target, which in turn would allow us to provide incentives or subsidies or some other mechanism to encourage reuse at producers. So we'd strongly encourage responding to question 21 and 29, 42 and 43, encouraging reuse. And just as a reminder, by the way, we will capture all of this in the document that we will be making available to our members and to anyone else who wants it. So there's no need to be frantically worrying about how you might capture this. We will certainly be making suggestions available. And it would be a great opportunity to encourage reuse in our sector. And the last proposal is to propose to extend and increase collections of business WEEE and to offer businesses free collection of business WEEE. And we recommend supporting the proposal. This is certainly something that we do already for our members, and for subject to minimum quantities, the customers of Recolight members are able to access free of charge collection and recycling of WEEE. That goes above and beyond the current B2B requirements, but in fact these new proposals are much closer to what to the way Recolight operates at the moment. And Recolight surveys have confirmed that if you make recycling free of charge to businesses at the point of need, it increases collection rates. Businesses are less likely to put the product in the bottom of a skip and more likely to make it available for recycling. So in summary, the voice of producers really matters, and our responses will help to drive regulatory change and to control costs. And this is a once-in-a-decade opportunity. We last had an opportunity to make changes of this scale in WEEE back in 2013. So it's time for questions, and as I mentioned, please use the Q&A box at the bottom right of your screen. We've got some questions already that we'll start, and we will move on to questions now. So I'll invite Graeme and Matt to switch on their video and audio. Right, so we have, first of all, one question from Frank Thomas. Frank, who is Compliance Manager at ATG Airports. And Frank notes that all of the luminaires that ATG Airports place on the market are B2B, intended to aid pilots when landing aircraft. He says that the current legislation defines large-scale fixed installations, and he's wanting to know if DEFRA have any intention through the call for evidence to change the definition of large-scale fixed installations. So, Graeme or Matt, do you want to respond to that?
I can respond. I think the answer is we haven't got any plans to change that definition. We've certainly not consulted on any alternative definition. Obviously, if as part of our consultation, people think this is something we need to look at, then obviously we're happy to do that. The consultation and call for evidence, set out some thoughts, but we're not saying for a minute that we've thought of absolutely everything. So if this is an issue for the industry, then by all means reflect it in your response, and we can look at it. Just on that, can I just add something that we haven't? I think neither of us have kind of been clear on, and that is this is a UK-wide consultation. This is a consultation with the UK government, Scottish government, the Welsh government, the Northern Ireland executive, our starting position is that we have a set of UK-wide regulations. Our position across all 4 nations is that that is the approach that we should continue to embrace. But the important thing that people need to understand is that, you know, waste is an area of devolved competence. So, you know, it is entirely plausible, let's say, or legally possible that the Scots could choose to set up their own WEEE system and the Welsh do their own thing, etc. So when we are actually finalising what it is we are actually going to do, it is not just the UK government making decisions, it is all 4 governments making decisions and collectively agreeing on what those decisions will be. I think that's important, and I thought I should just mention it.
Thank you, Graeme. Next question is from Tom Ruddle, who's lead remanufacture engineer at Egg Lighting. And he's basically asking if there are any financial mechanisms that would encourage reuse or remanufacture being contemplated within the changes that you've been discussing.
Okay, so I mean, I think you alluded to this exact point in your summary of areas, Nigel, that you just described. Certainly, the call for evidence, we are looking at ways in which, you know, we can encourage reuse. I guess we're using that word in sort of fairly broad terms. You know, equally remanufacture. We've talked about various proposals in which we can encourage companies to embrace a more circular approach to the way they do business. We've set some thoughts down in the call for evidence, but it sounds as though, Nigel, you've also done some thinking and will be some sharing with some thoughts with your members as well, which is great. We're not claiming for a minute that in setting out our thoughts we've covered all bases and we've got all the answers, because quite clearly we haven't. So it's great to hear that your industry are actively thinking about these issues as well.
Thank you. And I do think that actually extending that ability to report, to give a higher weighting to reuse to producers when they remanufacture would really incentivize circularity and reuse within our sector and in many other sectors as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting one to explore. I mean, the other thing that we're looking at is the extent to which companies that are that have circular business models. I'm thinking about companies that are leasing equipment rather than selling equipment, where when it where the product isn't actually owned by the end user, and when it's due for an upgrade or a refresh, it's returned to the producer. There's a question there around, to what extent should those companies actually be sharing the costs around disposing of equipment, whether that's household or business equipment. But I mean, if your company is effectively receiving your equipment back when it reaches, let's say, the end of its first life, and then refurbishing it or paying for the cost for it to be properly disposed of in some cases, if that's what you're doing with your equipment, why should you be paying for the cost or contributing towards the cost of equipment that ends up at maybe a household waste site or returned under other sort of collective systems? So those are areas that we're quite interested to look at.
And in fact, I think you've just nicely answered a question from Neil Willits, who says that some manufacturers are moving to a return to sender and a remanufacture model. Is this something that's being considered, that return to manufacturing the WEEE stream? How could it be better managed? And I think you've sort of covered that actually there are ways in which you're considering changing the system to reflect and reward such closed loop models.
Absolutely, yeah. So definitely interested in people's views and thoughts on those kind of concepts.
Thank you. Theo Pazaya, who's at ETAP Lighting International, asks, do the changes on the WEEE regulations affect markings or labellings on product, manual or packaging? Matt, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I mean, obviously we have the crossed out wheelie bin symbol. That is the only sort of mandatory label that we require producers put on their products. There is a question around when we talk about eco-modulation, we're talking about, you know, there are specific criteria, resource efficiency criteria or product design criteria, which we might use as a basis for modulation. So I mentioned things like repairability, durability. There is a question in the call for evidence as to whether or not that could be supported by a label to sort of show that a product has been designed in a certain way. But we don't have any, you know, this is just seeking ideas. This is in the call for evidence. We don't have any sort of firm proposals around mandatory labeling. And I know there's also, the other thing is there's also other work going on more widely in DESNES, who look after the eco-design regulations, who already look at things like energy efficiency labels. I think they might also be looking at introducing a resource efficiency label for electrical goods. So obviously we don't want too many labels. We want to make sure everything's kind of, you know, we don't want to duplicate labels. So, you know, we're going to look at what's going on in the wider picture as well. But yeah, no firm plans, but there are some ideas in the call for evidence around labeling.
Thanks, Matt. And Peter Thorns asks a question. New regulations seem to require that non-compliant product already placed on the market needs to be scrapped. So how does that fit in with the aim to prevent unused product from being scrapped? And I guess this is in part a reference to the banning of product being sent to incineration or landfill.
Yeah, I'm not
Graeme,
sure. Yeah, I'm not sure I quite understand the question, but I mean, certainly our thinking is, you know, the issue around kind of excess stock, surplus stock, and ensuring that at a minimum that goes for recycling. So I'm not quite clear on the point that we're trying to expand on there.
I guess he's perhaps also partly asking how, you know, if we're having to scrap product that is new and unused but is technically not compliant with the latest legislation, how you know, how does that square with the need to be more circular?
Right, okay. Well, clearly, you know, the eco design regulations would be an example, I guess, of you know, regulations that are effectively setting product standards, and there may be some occasions, I guess, where those regulations, when they enter force, do so in such a way as to leave some businesses with surplus stock that can no longer be sold in the UK. That isn't always the government's approach. I mean, if we look at the our proposals that we announced yesterday on banning disposable vapes, you know, in essence, what we're saying is we are going to ban disposable vapes. We are going to provide a reasonable time in which those companies that have existing stocks can essentially continue to you know, sell those stocks. But of course, where the government chooses to introduce their legislation such that people will have old stock that can no longer be sold, then what we would be saying is we would want to see that stock being recycled, so at least we can recover the material rather than it being incinerated or landfilled.
Understood, thank you. Kevin Shaw asked an interesting question. He says that they've already got WEEE Curbside together with glass recycling and collection in Edinburgh, but they're not sure what the size limit is. And there is, as a result, you sometimes get bags of WEEE and things like microwave ovens abandoned by collectors because they're too big. So he's saying, are there any plans to determine what might be an appropriate size or weight in the regulation so that everyone knows what is and isn't acceptable?
Yeah. So I seem to have got an echo. In fact, there seems to be two of me now on the line. I'm not quite sure what I've done. Am I coming across okay, Nigel?
You're coming across fine, no echo.
Yeah, so we are consulting in terms of what effectively what should be included in the small collection service in terms of size. It is the case that there are somewhere in the region of 86 local authorities that provide a curbside collection service to their areas. But the reality is that those curbside collection services are not particularly well promoted. A very small volume comes through those services, and anecdotal evidence suggests that when people try to use those services, it is quite often difficult, because perhaps you might put a toaster out, but by the time the truck gets to your home, they've already collected 5 toasters from other people on the round, and so therefore there's no room on the vehicle for your toaster. So there are challenges. Whilst there are quite a number of local authorities that are providing those services, they're not particularly well publicised, and sometimes they can be difficult to access. Obviously, the advantage with us suggesting that a service is managed on a nationwide basis on behalf of producers via a central function, hopefully that ensures that that there is let's say a sort of common standard that might apply in terms of level of service, even if the nature of the service might differ from in different areas depending on the nature of the area that you're servicing. So hopefully that provides a little bit of response there.
Indeed, thank you. And clearly, as Kevin says, actually understanding that what is permissible is going to be quite important in helping consumers to do the right thing.
Yeah, can I just make one other point, which forgive me, I don't think it was particularly clear in our slides. We're talking about we talked about moving the point of producer responsibility to the home and having a central function to deliver that. A key part of that is the whole communications thing, and we see that I think as being the responsibility of the central function as well, to not only provide the service. It might seem obvious, but I think it's an important point to make. Not only provide the service, but tell people it exists and how they should access it.
Indeed, thank you. And in fact, some good work is already being done on communicating with consumers, which is funded via something called the WEEE compliance fee. There's a character known as HypnoCat who encourages us to do the right thing with our WEEE. A question now from Rob Waters. Interesting question. Where is WEEE winning? I.e., which sectors have got some of the best collection rates, and is there an exemplar sector that others can learn from?
That's an interesting one. I think I mean, if you look at collection rates, probably fridges and cooling equipment is pretty high. I think that would probably have the highest collection rate, but that is simply because in truth, your options as a consumer in terms of how you get rid of an old fridge are pretty limited. You could put it on the end of the drive, but given the restrictions, the permitting restrictions around recycling fridges, if you put it on your end of the drive, the local scrap man probably will not pick it up. He'll probably just come along, snap the compressor off the back of the fridge and take that to get the copper value. So you're still left with the fridge on your end of the drive. So your options basically are to return the fridge to the retailer when he delivers the new one, which typically attracts a charge of 20-30 quid. Or to take it to the household waste site. So I don't think I would suggest there isn't a particular sector that stands out. It is just a consequence of reality that more fridges are probably collected and properly treated than any other item. Obviously, large appliances, your washing machines, and other white goods that are not fridges, they have a high commercial value at end of life because of the scrap metal value. So some of those appliances come to the WEEE system, but what you find is when there's a high scrap price, you see less coming into the WEEE system and more going through the scrap metal route, which I think it's fair to say the jury's probably out as to whether, if a washing machine goes down a scrap route, whether it's better recycled through that route, or whether it isn't. I'm not sure, but yeah, I don't think there's any winners.
Actually, I will just take an opportunity to answer Rob's question by blowing our own trumpet for a moment. And that is, when it comes to B2B, actually, you may not know this, Graeme, Matt, but Recolight's probably the UK's largest collector of B2B WEEE. And we disproportionately collect far more than our membership would imply. So very roughly, and these numbers are not quite correct, but our members place on the market, I can't remember, about 4% of all the B2BE, but we collect about 18, somewhere between 18 to 20% of all B2B WEEE. And that's probably a consequence of the fact that we, through our members, offer a free of charge collection service to business end users, and that's both street lighting and commercial lighting. And so it's perhaps evidence that that change or that you're proposing in B2B has a real potential to drive up collection and proper treatment rates. Right, we have one more question from Paul Young. And Paul makes the point that companies sometimes invest in LED lighting thinking that they're saving energy, but sometimes it's very little, and often the product only lasts for a few years, and perhaps that then ends up being worse than the previous technology that they were replacing, as in incandescent or fluorescent, because the whole unit needs to be replaced rather than just a bulb. I mean, I think this is as much a reference to the need to have a replaceable LED module and the need to have standards that ensure that product sold is actually has a good lifetime. I don't know whether there's anything on WEEE that you particularly want to pick up on there. It may be more a product performance issue rather than a WEEE issue.
Yeah, I think it feels to me a sort of an eco design issue. Noting what Matt was saying in his piece, that eco design isn't just about energy performance. It also looks at the broader question of resource efficiency. We're floating the sort of concept of eco modulation in the call for evidence, and I suppose it's conceivable that you could have a set of requirements for lighting products that if they meet those requirements, to put it simply, the cost of compliance is cheaper than for those companies that are not meeting those requirements. And maybe replaceability of the LED lighting, the LED module, having the ability to do that might be might fall into one of those measures, for example.
Indeed. Okay, well, we're just a smidgen over 12 o'clock, and we've also answered all the questions. So on behalf of everybody who's been listening in, and on behalf of Recolight, Graeme, Matt, thank you so much for such a well-informed and concise and clear presentation of the issues. And once again, I would encourage everybody to get involved and to respond and to contact members at recolight.co.uk. If you're not a member, we'll be happy to provide you with some suggestions on how the response might go. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll call it a day. Thank you. Goodbye now.